It was a stormy night in late October. The kind of night that gnaws at the soul, leaving a chill that seeps into the bones no matter how many layers of blankets you pile on. The wind howled outside, and rain battered the windows like angry fists. Inside the small, isolated cabin, Sean sat by the dim glow of a single lantern, trying to distract himself from the howl of the storm with an old, dusty book. He had come here to escape, to get away from the noise of the city and find peace, but there was something else, a feeling, something that kept gnawing at the back of his mind. He wasn't alone. His thoughts were interrupted when he heard the first knock. It was soft at first, a tap-tap-tap as though it were the wind playing tricks on the walls. But then it came again, harder, more insistent. He stood up from his chair, confused. Who would be out here in the storm? The nearest town was miles away, and the roads were barely passable even without the rain. He made his way to the door, peering out through the thick, wooden slats. What he saw sent a shiver down his spine. Two figures stood in the rain, drenched from head to toe, their clothing hanging off their bodies like shadows clinging to the darkness. Their heads were bowed low, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. The only thing Sean could see clearly were their eyes, wide, gleaming, and wrong. There was something unnatural about them. They didn't blink. They didn't move their eyes. For a moment, Sean hesitated. But the cold and the fear gnawed at him. He had always been the type to help others when they were in need, and the storm showed no sign of letting up. Plus, there was something about the way they stood there, as though they were waiting for him to open the door, that felt almost inevitable. With a shaky breath, he unlatched the door and pulled it open. The figures stepped inside without a word, and Sean instinctively stepped back to let them in. Their movements were unnervingly smooth, as though they were gliding, not walking. The first figure, a tall man, dropped his hood. His face was pale, almost unnaturally so, and his hair was slicked back, wet and dark. His eyes, those eyes, were the color of the stormy sky outside, a deep gray that seemed to swirl with a depth that felt like they could see through him, past him, into something deeper. His lips barely moved when he spoke. "Thank you," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm for the situation. "We need shelter for the night." Before Sean could respond, the second figure, a woman, pulled back her hood. Her hair cascaded down in damp waves, but it was her eyes that made his breath catch. They were wrong. Too large, too dark. Her irises were a shade of violet so deep it almost looked black, and they glistened as if reflecting something Sean couldn't see. He stood frozen, caught in the eerie, mesmerizing gaze of the two strangers. Without a word, they moved further inside. It felt as if they didn't need to ask for permission. They were already inside, their presence hanging like a heavy fog. Sean barely had time to think before the door was shut, and the room fell into an uneasy silence. The wind howled louder outside, the storm raging in full force now, but inside the cabin, an unnatural stillness took hold. Sean forced himself to speak, his voice a little shakier than he intended. "Where are you from?" he asked, trying to break the tension. The man smiled, a thin, cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It doesn't matter," he said softly. "We've been traveling for some time. We just need a place to rest." The woman stepped closer, her gaze never leaving Sean's face. "We'll leave when the storm passes," she said in a tone that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Her voice was too smooth, too soft, like a lullaby, but there was something about it that felt off. The kind of off that makes your skin crawl and your heart race. Sean nodded, despite the unease spreading through him. "Of course. Just make yourselves comfortable. I'll get you some dry towels." He quickly walked toward the small bathroom in the back, trying to shake off the strange, heavy feeling that had settled in his chest. He'd let them in. He'd done the right thing, he told himself. They were just travelers lost in the storm. But something inside him knew, deep down, that this wasn't just about a storm. The moment he stepped back into the living room, he felt it. The air had changed. The two figures were sitting now, but they weren't talking. They were watching him in a way that made him feel like prey, like something they were sizing up before making their move. "Are you hungry?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. They didn't answer right away. The man simply looked at him, and for a moment, Sean could have sworn that the eyes he'd seen earlier had deepened, like a storm cloud threatening to burst. His heart skipped a beat. The woman's voice broke the silence, low and slow, like a whisper from the darkness. "No," she said, her violet eyes gleaming. "We're not hungry, not in the way you think." The words made no sense, but the coldness in her tone made Sean's stomach churn. His mind raced, and he found himself unable to move, his feet glued to the floor. "What do you mean?" he asked, his throat dry. The woman smiled, and for the first time, it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was something darker, something predatory. "You'll find out soon enough," she said. Sean opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was frozen, the sense of dread mounting inside him, pressing against his chest like an invisible weight. And then, just as suddenly, the man spoke again. "Thank you for letting us in," he said. "Now, we can rest." The room seemed to grow colder. The wind howled louder outside, but inside the cabin, everything was still. Too still. As the hours passed, Sean tried his best to ignore the growing sense of unease that clung to the cabin like the storm outside. He kept telling himself that it was just his imagination, that he was being paranoid. The two strangers had settled in, and aside from a few strange glances, they didn't speak much. They simply sat by the fire, their eyes fixed on the flickering flames, as though they were lost in some far-off thought. But there was something about their stillness, something wrong, that made Sean feel like he wasn't alone in the room, even when they said nothing at all. The storm raged on, a constant roar of wind and rain outside, but inside, the cabin was strangely warm. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if something was pressing down on him. Sean couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, but every time he turned, the strangers were simply staring ahead, unmoving. He made an excuse to go to the kitchen, hoping to distract himself. Maybe if he kept busy, he could shake the feeling that something was terribly off. He moved around the small kitchen, preparing some sandwiches, trying to push the thoughts of the strange guests out of his mind. But the silence from the living room stretched on, too long. The man's words echoed in his mind, "We're not hungry, not in the way you think." Sean tried to focus on the task at hand, but the unease grew. He didn't want to look back into the living room. He was afraid of what he might see. What if they weren't just lost travelers? What if they were something else? Suddenly, he heard a creak from the living room. A sound so slight it could have been the wind settling the wood beams, but it made his pulse quicken. He didn't want to go back in there. Not after what the woman had said. But before he could stop himself, his feet carried him back to the living room. As soon as he entered, he froze. The woman was standing in front of the fireplace, her back to him, but it wasn't the strange position that made his heart stop. It was her eyes. They were no longer just wide and unblinking. They were glowing. A faint, eerie light pulsed from within the depths of her violet irises, and for a moment, Sean thought he could see swirling shapes, figures, and faces within them. It was as if the eyes were a window to something far darker than he could comprehend. The man stood beside her now, silent, his gaze still locked on Sean. There was no warmth in his expression, just the chilling cold of something inhuman. "Are you okay?" Sean's voice barely came out as a whisper, but it was the only thing he could manage to say. The woman turned slowly, her smile now wide, too wide. Her lips stretched impossibly far, as though something was forcing her face to twist, to stretch. The smile was not human. It was the grin of something ancient and malevolent. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice low and hypnotic. "But I don't think you are." Sean took a step back, his pulse racing. His eyes flicked nervously from the woman to the man, then back again. "What do you want from me?" The words slipped out before he could stop them. He regretted them instantly, but they hung in the air, demanding an answer. The woman's eyes gleamed brighter, the violet hue turning almost to a sickly white, as though they were burning. "We only want what's ours," she said, her voice now echoing in the back of his mind. "You have something we need, something you don't even know you're keeping." "What are you talking about?" Sean demanded, panic rising in his chest. His mind raced, trying to find an explanation. Maybe they were just delusional. Maybe they were sick, But that didn't explain the way they moved or the way their eyes glowed. The man stepped forward, his gray eyes never leaving Sean's. "You invited us in. That means you've accepted what's coming," he said, his tone chillingly matter-of-fact. Sean shook his head, backing away. His heart hammered in his chest, the room closing in around him. No, this isn't real," Sean muttered under his breath. "You're not real." The woman's gaze never faltered. Her smile never wavered. "Oh, but we are," she said softly, her voice cutting through the storm outside. "And now, so are you." A low, rumbling growl came from the man's throat, barely audible but unmistakable. He was no longer just a man. His face twisted, his features warping, elongating, as if something else was trying to break free. The pale skin around his eyes began to crack, revealing a deep blackness beneath, like a hollow void. The air in the room grew colder still, and Sean felt the temperature drop, his breath coming out in visible puffs. The woman's form seemed to blur, and in the next instant, she was standing right in front of him, her face inches from his. Her breath was cold, unnatural, and it sent a shudder through him. Her eyes, those glowing violet eyes, bore into him, pulling him closer, deeper into the abyss. "You don't have a choice now," she whispered, her voice slithering into his mind. "We're taking what's ours, and you're not leaving." The man's hand shot out, gripping Sean's arm with a force that sent a jolt of fear through his body. His grip was impossibly tight, and his fingers seemed to sink into Sean's flesh, like claws. In an instant, Sean was no longer standing in the cabin. The storm outside vanished, the fire flickering out, leaving only darkness. He was standing in a vast, empty space, cold and suffocating. Around him, shadowy figures moved in the periphery, whispering in a language he couldn't understand, but the words felt familiar. They felt wrong. "You're here now," the woman's voice echoed, her figure looming just ahead of him. Her eyes still glowed, and they burned into his soul. "You've crossed over. Welcome to our world." Sean gasped for air, his chest heaving as though he had been submerged underwater for an eternity. The cold was unbearable, an unnatural chill that cut through him like ice. His skin prickled with goosebumps, and his teeth chattered uncontrollably, though he could barely feel his hands. The darkness around him was suffocating, a void that stretched on endlessly. He was no longer in the cabin. He knew that now. The cozy little room with its fire and creaky floors was gone. The storm outside had vanished too, leaving only a crushing silence. Panic gripped his throat as he turned in every direction, desperately seeking any sign of life, anything that could explain where he was. But all he could see were the shadows, shapes that moved just beyond his peripheral vision. They were there, he was sure of it, but they never fully revealed themselves. Their presence was more like a feeling than a sight, a looming presence that made his breath catch in his throat. "Where am I?" Sean's voice cracked as he whispered into the emptiness. His words felt foreign, lost in the vast silence. He tried to move, but his feet felt heavy, as though they were sinking into the cold ground. He looked down, but there was nothing beneath him. No floor. No earth. Just an endless expanse of darkness. Then, as if the darkness itself had heard his thoughts, the shadows began to gather, swirling around him like a storm of black smoke. At first, they were slow, hesitant, but soon they grew faster, more aggressive, closing in on him. He could hear them now, whispers, indistinct murmurs that sent a wave of dread through his chest. The air grew colder still, the whispers turning into something more tangible, more real. They were no longer whispers. They were voices. Distorted, broken, and hollow, but unmistakably human. Sean stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to scream, but his voice wouldn't come. His legs felt like lead, his body paralyzed by the suffocating weight of the darkness pressing in on him. He was trapped. Trapped in a place that wasn't real, yet felt like everything around him was. Then the voices stopped. The darkness stilled. And through the void, a pair of glowing eyes emerged. The violet eyes of the woman. Her figure slowly took shape, materializing out of the blackness. She stood before him, her unnaturally pale skin gleaming in the shadows, Her lips curled into that same cold, predatory smile. Her eyes were now fully illuminated, glowing brighter than before, like two burning orbs that pierced the darkness. "Did you think you could escape?" Her voice was soft, almost comforting, but there was no warmth in it. It was cold like ice. "You let us in, Sean. And now you belong to us." He couldn't speak. His throat was dry, his body frozen in terror. The woman stepped closer, and the shadows around him seemed to move with her, shifting like liquid in the air. "You're in our world now," she continued, her smile widening. "And you'll never leave." Sean wanted to run, to break free from this nightmare, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. His body was numb, his mind paralyzed with fear. All he could do was watch as she drew closer, her presence growing larger, more overwhelming with each step. The shadows began to writhe around her, as though they were alive, feeding off the fear that radiated from him. Sean's heart pounded in his chest, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts, desperation, panic, disbelief. He had to escape. He had to wake up. This couldn't be real. But the more he tried to break free, the more the darkness tightened around him. He was caught in a web of his own terror, his limbs bound by invisible threads that pulled him toward the woman. Her eyes glowed brighter now, and he could feel them burning into his soul. "We've been watching you for a long time," she whispered, her voice almost hypnotic now. "You were always meant to be part of this. All of it. Your life, your choices, they've led you to us." Sean's mind reeled. "What do you mean?" he gasped. I don't understand." "You didn't understand before," the woman said, her smile cruel and sharp. "But you will now. You have no choice. You're ours, Sean. And when we're done with you, you will never be the same." Before he could react, a sharp, searing pain shot through his chest, a cold fire that spread through his veins like liquid ice. He screamed, but the sound was lost in the vast emptiness. The pain twisted inside him, gnawing at his insides, tearing him apart from the inside out. He tried to move, to break free, but the shadows were holding him in place, tightening their grip. The man, the thing, appeared next to the woman, his form twisting and shifting in ways that were impossible to describe. His body seemed to elongate, his face warping into something grotesque. His gray eyes were filled with a cold, detached malice as he reached out toward Sean. "Don't worry," he said, his voice an echo in the void. "This will only hurt for a moment. But in the end, you'll understand. You'll understand everything." Sean's body trembled, his vision blurring with tears. He couldn't breathe. The pain was unbearable. His chest constricted as if his heart was being torn from his body. But then, just as he thought he couldn't endure it any longer, the pain stopped. The air around him grew still, and he collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. His hands shook as they pressed against the cold ground. "You've crossed over," the woman whispered, her voice distant but unmistakable. "And now you are one of us." The darkness around him receded, the shadows fading as though they were never really there. Sean's vision cleared, and he found himself back in the cabin. But everything was different. The warmth from the fire was gone. The cabin was dark, colder than it had ever been. The storm outside had disappeared, leaving an eerie stillness that hung heavy in the air. He looked around, his mind racing. The man and the woman were standing there, their eyes locked on him, waiting. And as Sean slowly stood up, he realized something terrifying. Their eyes no longer looked like those of mere humans. They were full of something else. Something older. Something hungry. "You're one of us now," the man said again, his voice colder than before. "Welcome home." The cabin was no longer the same. It had once been a place of safety, a refuge from the chaos of the world outside, but now it was a prison. The walls seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if the very wood had come alive. The fire, which once crackled with warmth, had died out, leaving only a cold, empty hearth. Shadows clung to the corners of the room, and the silence was suffocating. Sean's mind struggled to make sense of what had happened. What had he let in? What had he brought into his home? The woman and the man stood before him, their eyes now an abyss of darkness, empty and hollow. They were no longer human, at least not in any way that he understood. The air around them felt unnatural, heavy, as though reality itself was bending to their will. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as if they had all the time in the world. Sean's legs were trembling, his whole body shaking with an energy he couldn't explain. It felt like he had just woken from a nightmare, but everything was real. Everything was tangible. He could still feel the aftereffects of the pain, the coldness that had seeped into his bones. He was no longer sure what was real anymore. Was this world, this cabin, still the one he knew? Or had it changed forever? The man's voice broke through his thoughts. "You're still trying to understand, aren't you?" Sean looked up, meeting the man's eyes, and he felt a shudder run through his spine. There was nothing there, no humanity, no warmth. Only an endless, inky void. "You've crossed over, Sean. And now you must accept it," the woman said, her voice silky and cold. "The world you knew is no longer yours. You're part of ours now. Part of something greater." Sean's mind reeled. Crossed over? What did they mean by that? "You'll never leave here," the man continued, taking a step closer. "But you'll be more than you were. You'll be one of us." The words were like a curse, a weight that pressed down on his chest. He felt trapped, suffocated by the enormity of it all. "What are you?" he finally managed to ask, his voice a weak whisper. "We are not what you think," the woman said, her lips curling into a dark smile. "We are ancient. We've existed long before your world was born. And now your world is ours. Your life, your soul, belongs to us." The air around him thickened, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching out like dark tendrils. They twisted, wrapped around the furniture, creeping along the walls, seeking out every corner of the room. Sean's breathing became ragged, his chest tight. It felt like the very space he was standing in was suffocating him. "What do you want from me?" Sean asked, his voice cracking as panic rose in his throat. The man took another step forward, his shadow growing larger, more monstrous. "We want nothing from you, Sean. You gave it to us willingly. When you invited us in, you accepted our terms." The woman stepped beside him, her eyes glowing once more, their violet hue brighter than ever. "You're ours now," she said softly, "and you will serve us. Your existence will be forever tied to ours." Suddenly, the room began to spin. The walls seemed to close in, and the floor beneath him felt as though it was sinking away. Sean tried to steady himself, but the dizziness overwhelmed him. The shadows writhed and contorted in the corners, moving as if they had lives of their own. The sound of their whispering grew louder, filling his ears until it was all he could hear. The voices spoke in a language he didn't understand, but they were unmistakable in their hunger, in their demand for something from him. He stumbled back, trying to move, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The woman's eyes were locked onto his, and he could feel her gaze tugging at him, pulling him toward her. The man's presence loomed over him like a dark cloud, suffocating him with its weight. "You're still resisting," the man said, his voice low and cold. "But you can't resist us, Sean. Not anymore." The shadows around him thickened, and he felt a coldness creep over his skin. His body froze, his limbs no longer responding to his commands. The darkness seemed to crawl under his skin, seeping into his veins. What had he done? A sudden surge of anger hit him, and for the first time since they had entered the cabin, he tried to fight back. He fought the cold, fought the darkness that threatened to swallow him whole. He reached for the door, his fingers brushing the handle, but it wouldn't open. No matter how hard he pulled, the door wouldn't budge. It was as if the cabin itself was holding him captive, trapping him in this nightmare. The woman's laugh echoed through the room, a sound that sent chills down his spine. "You can't escape," she said, her voice laced with dark amusement. "There's no way out." "You wanted us in," the man added, stepping closer, his form now towering over Sean. "And now you will stay. Forever." The shadows began to shift again, swirling around Sean like a storm. His chest tightened, and he gasped for breath, but it was no use. The darkness was suffocating him, pulling him deeper into its grasp. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the shadows began to recede. The weight lifted from his chest, and Sean found himself standing alone in the room again. The air was still. The fire had burned out completely, leaving nothing but ashes. The cabin felt empty, hollow, like a place that had been abandoned for years. Sean blinked, disoriented. Was it over? Had they left? He turned slowly, scanning the room for any sign of the strange visitors, but they were gone. The silence was deafening, and for a moment he almost allowed himself to believe it was all just a dream. But as he stood there, staring at the empty room, something caught his eye. A small, dark shape on the floor. He stepped forward cautiously, and as he crouched down, he gasped in horror. It was a symbol, carved into the wooden floor, its edges jagged and sharp. It seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, as though it were alive. The symbol was unlike anything Sean had ever seen, its meaning completely foreign to him. He traced his finger along the lines of the symbol, and a jolt of electricity shot through his body. His heart skipped a beat, and the room seemed to tilt again. The shadows were not gone. They were waiting. The woman's voice whispered through his mind, her words cold and final. "You are ours now, Sean. Forever." Sean's hand hovered over the symbol on the floor, his skin tingling as though the very air around it was charged with electricity. His heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel the coldness creeping back into his bones, seeping deeper, harder, faster. He tried to pull away, but it was as if the symbol had a grip on him, pulling him closer, dragging him into the darkness once more. For a moment, the world around him seemed to blur, his vision spinning. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the whispering voices returned, louder this time. They surrounded him, crawling inside his mind, their words no longer in some distant, unknown language. He understood them now, every single one. "You are ours," they hissed, their voices blending into one unified force. "You are nothing. You will never be free." A sickening wave of dread washed over Sean. His stomach turned, and he fought to hold onto his sanity, but the more he struggled, the tighter the grip of the shadows became. He could hear footsteps behind him, slow, deliberate, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as the presence of the man and the woman returned. They were here. Sean spun around, his legs shaking beneath him. His breath was ragged, his mind a mess of thoughts and panic, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to fight. He had to survive. "You're wrong," Sean gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't invite you in. I didn't know what I was doing. I was just trying to be nice." The woman stepped forward, her eyes glowing even brighter now, their light casting an eerie hue over her pale face. She smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was twisted, like a predator toying with its prey. "You think this is about politeness?" she purred, her voice dripping with mockery. "You think you can just be nice to us and expect to get away? We are not some simple guest to be invited and dismissed. We are ancient Sean. We are the darkness that preys upon the living, the eternal hunger that gnaws at the edges of reality. And now you belong to us." The man laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent a chill through Sean's very core. "There's no escape. You made your choice the moment you invited us in." Sean's heart raced as he stumbled backward, his mind desperately grasping for something, anything, to fight back with. His eyes fell on the fireplace, the cold ashes of a once warm fire now lying dormant. He glanced around the room, searching for anything he could use as a weapon, but all he saw was the symbol on the floor and the dark, oppressive air that seemed to smother every inch of space. His thoughts raced. The symbol. The thought flashed in his mind like a sudden spark. It has to mean something. It has to be a way out. Without thinking, he dropped to his knees and pressed his hands against the symbol, his fingers trembling. As soon as his skin made contact with the cold wood, the world around him seemed to shift violently. The shadows flared up, whipping around the room like a violent storm, but they weren't the same shadows as before. These shadows were darker, denser, more alive than anything he had ever felt. For a split second, Sean thought he could hear something, a deep, rumbling growl that vibrated through the floor beneath him, a sound that seemed to come from the very walls of the cabin. "And," the woman screeched, her voice filled with fury. "You cannot break it. You cannot defy us." The man lunged toward him, but it was too late. The darkness had already begun to pulse, shifting in ways that defied logic, pulling at the very fabric of reality. Sean's hands burned as if they were being seared by fire, but he didn't stop. He pressed harder, pushing deeper into the symbol. The shadows seemed to convulse, as if they were in pain. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, the cold biting through Sean's clothes, numbing his fingers, but he kept going. The growl grew louder, more insistent, until it felt as though the cabin itself was alive, responding to the force he had triggered. Then, the symbols on the floor began to glow. They lit up like veins of light coursing through the cabin, illuminating the walls, the floors, and the ceiling. For a moment, Sean felt a surge of hope. Hope that he could do this, that he could stop them. But the very next second, that hope was dashed as the man and the woman's figures began to shift, warping in a way that made Sean's stomach churn. Their bodies twisted, elongated, and distorted, becoming monstrous, like something out of a nightmare. "You cannot escape us, Sean." The woman's voice was now low, guttural, more animal than human. Her face contorted into something unrecognizable, her eyes glowing like two blazing orbs of fury. The man's form followed suit, his limbs growing unnaturally long, his eyes turning into black, empty pits. "We will consume you," he snarled, his voice no longer recognizable. "You are nothing. You never were." The air in the room became suffocating as the shadows seemed to draw closer, surrounding him, and the coldness spread until it felt as though the very air had frozen solid. Sean could barely breathe, his lungs burning as he struggled to stay conscious, to hold onto his fading sense of reality. And then it happened. The symbol on the floor burst into light, a blinding flash that filled every corner of the room. The shadows recoiled, screeching in pain, as if they were being pulled away from the very source of their existence. Sean's hands flew up to shield his eyes, but the light was so intense that it consumed everything. It felt like his very soul was being torn from his body. But just as quickly as it began, the light vanished, leaving the room in an eerie, unnatural silence. Sean's eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light. When he finally opened them fully, he saw the room had changed, shifted. The man and the woman were no longer standing before him. They were gone. The shadows had receded, leaving only an unsettling stillness behind. He collapsed to the floor, his chest heaving, his mind reeling. His entire body was cold, numb from the touch of the shadows, but something deep inside him told him that the danger had not passed. He was still here. He was still in the cabin. But the nightmare, was it truly over? The silence felt oppressive, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. Sean stood up, his legs shaky, his body drained of every ounce of energy, but the room was still. The symbol on the floor, now completely dark and lifeless, no longer pulsed with energy. The shadows were gone, and with them, the eerie presence of the figures that had haunted him. For a brief moment, he dared to hope that it was over, that he had somehow won, had somehow broken free. But then he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the corner of the room, the symbol had reappeared. And beneath it, glowing faintly, was a message: "You can never leave."